At my son's birthday party, my daughter-in-law shoved 2 heavy bags of trash into my hands and announced, "That's what she's for. Our live-in maid." The room erupted in laughter, until one voice cut through the noise. "Do you even know who she really is?" Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The kitchen timer's shrill cry pierced through the afternoon heat, and I wiped my hands on the dish rag, the same faded blue one I'd been using for 3 years now, since moving into this cramped apartment behind my son's house. 64 years old, and I was still jumping at the sound of timers, still measuring my worth in perfectly risen soufflés and knife cuts so precise they could make a surgeon weep. But today wasn't about my cooking. Today was about Seth's 35th birthday, and according to my daughter-in-law Mabel, I was simply the help. I adjusted the collar of my best dress, a champagne shirt dress I'd bought 5 years ago, back when I still had my own kitchen, my own life, and checked my reflection in the small mirror by the door. Gray roots were showing through my auburn dye job, and the lines around my eyes seemed deeper than they had last week. When had I started looking so diminished? Through the thin walls separating my studio from their main house, I could hear the laughter and chatter of the party guests. 20 people, Mabel had told me yesterday, her perfectly manicured finger tapping against her iPhone screen as she scrolled through her contact list. "And Francine," she'd added without looking up, "make sure you stay in the background today. This isn't about you. It never was about me anymore." I picked up the birthday cake, a 3-layer chocolate masterpiece with hand-tempered ganache and gold leaf details that had taken me 2 days to perfect, and balanced it carefully in my hands. The weight of it reminded me of the wedding cakes I used to create at Le Bernardin, back when my name meant something in New York's culinary world, back when food critics would wait months for a reservation at my table. That was before the accident, before Marshall died, before I lost everything and had to move in with my only child, accepting charity disguised as family duty. The back door to the main house was propped open with a decorative stone frog. Mabel's touch. Everything in her world had to be just so, and I stepped through into the organized chaos of the party. The living room buzzed with conversation, designer handbags perched on every surface, wine glasses catching the afternoon light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Francine!" Mabel's voice cut through the noise like a blade. She appeared at my elbow, blonde highlights catching the light, her smile sharp as broken glass. "Perfect timing. Set that down on the kitchen island and then I have something for you." I placed the cake carefully on the marble surface, noting how Mabel's friends clustered around it with appreciative murmurs. "Did you make this yourself?" one of them asked. But Mabel was already pulling me away before I could answer. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mabel called out, raising her wine glass for attention. The conversations died down, all eyes turning to where we stood near the kitchen entrance. My stomach clenched with an inexplicable dread. "Before we sing happy birthday to my wonderful husband," she continued, her arms snaking around my shoulders in what might have looked like affection to an outsider, "I want to thank someone very special who made this whole day possible." My cheeks burned. This was it. The moment she would finally acknowledge all the work I'd done, not just today, but every day for 3 years. The cooking, the cleaning, the childcare when their 10-year-old Jean needed watching. Maybe she would even mention my professional background. The restaurants where I'd trained half the chefs these people probably admired. Instead, Mabel reached behind the kitchen counter and produced 2 large garbage bags, heavy with refuse from the party preparation. The smell hit me immediately. Coffee grounds, vegetable peels, wine corks, the detritus of celebration. "Everyone, meet Francine," Mabel announced, her voice syrupy sweet as she thrust both bags toward me. "Our live-in maid. That's what she's for. Cleaning up our messes, keeping house, making sure we never have to worry about the dirty work." The laughter started as a ripple and built to a wave. 20 pairs of eyes stared at me as I stood there, garbage bags in my hands like some grotesque party favor. My vision blurred at the edges, and I felt my carefully constructed composure cracking like a dropped plate. "She's so lucky to have us," Mabel continued, riding the wave of amusement. "I mean, where else would someone her age find such a comfortable arrangement?" More laughter. Seth stood across the room, beer in hand, not quite meeting my eyes, but not stopping his wife either. His silence felt like a physical blow. I opened my mouth to speak, to defend myself, to remind them all who I really was, but the words stuck in my throat like bones. What was the point? They'd already decided who I was in their narrative. The pathetic old woman grateful for scraps. That's when I heard it. A voice from the edge of the group, quiet but clear enough to cut through the laughter like a knife through butter. Did you know she's the legendary Francine Gray? The woman who spoke was small, maybe 40, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I didn't recognize her, but she was looking at me with something I hadn't seen in years: respect. She trained half the masters you people worship. The woman continued, stepping forward. Francine Gray of Le Bernardin, winner of 3 James Beard Awards, Scott Beard Awards. She was featured on the cover of Food and Wine 6 times. The laughter died like a snuffed candle. Mabel's smile faltered, her grip on her wine glass tightening until her knuckles went white. Around the room, faces shifted from amusement to confusion, to something approaching shame. That's not... Mabel started, but the woman wasn't finished. I'm Ruth Wilson. I write for Bon Appetit. She turned to address the room, her voice gaining strength. I've been trying to secure an interview with Francine Gray for 2 years. She's considered one of the most influential female chefs of the last 3 decades. Her techniques revolutionized French-American fusion cuisine. The silence stretched like taffy, thick and uncomfortable. I could hear the kitchen timer going off again in my little apartment. Something else I'd left cooking. Something else that would now be ruined. Seth finally stepped forward, his face pale. Mom, you never told us. You never asked, I said quietly, setting the garbage bags down on Mabel's pristine hardwood floor. My voice was steadier than I felt, but there was something new in it, something I hadn't heard in years. Steel. The party guests began to murmur among themselves, conversations starting and stopping in embarrassed fits. Someone mentioned a cookbook. Another person pulled out their phone to Google my name. Mabel stood frozen, her social gathering crumbling around her like a poorly constructed soufflé. I walked to the kitchen island and picked up a knife, one of my own actually, from the set I'd brought when I moved in. Mabel had been using them for 3 years without ever asking where they came from. The weight of it in my hand felt like coming home. The cake is chocolate Genoese with Belgian ganache and salted caramel filling, I announced to the room, my voice carrying the authority I'd almost forgotten I possessed. The gold leaf is real, not synthetic. The technique for the sugar work on top is something I developed in 1987. I began cutting perfect slices, each one exactly the same size, plated with the precision that had once earned me a spot in culinary history. The guests watched in fascination as I worked, as if seeing me for the first time. But I wasn't cutting cake for them anymore. I was cutting away 3 years of invisibility, 3 years of being reduced to nothing more than convenient domestic labor. Each slice was a declaration. I am still here. I still matter. I am still magnificent. Ruth Wilson approached the counter, her eyes bright with something I recognized as professional hunger. Ms. Gray? Would you consider that interview? I think the culinary world would be fascinated to know what you've been up to. I looked up from the cake, meeting her gaze directly. Around us, the party continued in awkward fragments, but something had shifted irrevocably. The careful hierarchy Mabel had constructed was cracking, and through those cracks, something dangerous was beginning to grow. Perhaps, I said, handing her a perfect slice of cake. But first, I think it's time I had a conversation with my family about our arrangement. The words hung in the air like the scent of burning pastry, and I watched as Mabel's perfectly controlled world began to crumble around her. She had wanted to humiliate me in front of her friends, to reduce me to nothing more than hired help. Instead, she had just reminded me exactly who I was. And now, they were all about to learn what happened when you tried to break a woman who had survived decades in professional kitchens, who had built empires from flour and fire, who had forgotten her own power but never truly lost it. The kitchen timer was still screaming in the distance, but I no longer felt the need to run toward it. After all, some things were worth letting burn. The silence that followed Ruth Wilson's revelation stretched like a held breath. 20 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to embarrassment to something I hadn't seen in years, genuine recognition. My hands, still gripping the serving knife, trembled slightly as the weight of my forgotten identity settled back around my shoulders like an old familiar coat. Mabel's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and Chardonnay. The sound seemed to break the spell that had fallen over the room. "I don't understand," she stammered, her face flushed red beneath her carefully applied makeup. You live in our guest house. You clean and cook, and you never once asked why a woman who just cleaned and cooked could prepare restaurant-quality meals every night. I finished quietly. You never wondered why I flinched every time you criticized my knife skills, or why I knew exactly which wines would pair with each course. Seth set down his beer and approached me, his face a map of confusion and something that might have been shame. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? About your career, about what you accomplished?" I looked at my son, my only child who had inherited his father's gentle eyes and weak spine, and felt something cold settle in my chest. "When exactly should I have told you, Seth? Between scrubbing your bathroom floors and babysitting Jean while you and Mabel went to dinner parties? Or maybe during one of those family meetings where you and Mabel decided how much I could spend on groceries?" The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the background music seemed to have faded away. Ruth Wilson stood beside me, her presence a reminder that there was still a world beyond this house that remembered who I used to be. "We gave you a place to live," Mabel said, but her voice had lost its earlier confidence. She was looking around the room, trying to gauge how much damage had been done to her carefully cultivated image. "After your husband died and you lost everything, we took you in." "You took me in," I repeated, tasting the words like spoiled milk. "Do you remember what you said to me the day I moved into that studio apartment? You said, 'Now you can finally be useful for once.'" Mabel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Several of her friends had begun gathering their purses, making quiet excuses about early dinners and forgotten appointments. The party was hemorrhaging guests, and Mabel's panic was becoming visible. I didn't mean..." "You meant exactly what you said," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "For 3 years, you've treated me like unpaid domestic help. You've taken credit for meals I prepared, used my professional knives without asking, and made jokes about the old woman living in your backyard to anyone who would listen." Seth stepped closer, reaching out as if to touch my arm. "Mom, please." Mabel was just trying to help. We all were. I stepped back, away from his reach, and something in my expression made him freeze. "Help? Is that what you call it when your wife makes me wear an apron to serve dinner to your friends? When she gives me a household allowance like I'm a teenager? When she introduces me as the help at your birthday party?" "You're being dramatic," Mabel said, but her voice cracked on the last word. "Everyone knew you were family." Ruth Wilson cleared her throat softly. "Actually, I didn't know. When I was introduced to Francine earlier, Mabel specifically told me she was the housekeeper." She turned to me, her expression gentle but resolute. "That's how I recognized you, actually. I thought it was strange that a housekeeper would have such perfect knife skills while preparing the canapes." The blood drained from Mabel's face. Around the room, the few remaining guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. The social hierarchy Mabel had worked so hard to construct was collapsing in real time. "I think," I said slowly, setting down the knife with deliberate care, "it's time we had an honest conversation about my living situation." "What do you mean?" Seth asked, though I could see in his eyes that he already knew. "I mean that I'm done being your live-in servant. I'm done pretending that your charity is actually family love. And I'm definitely done allowing your wife to humiliate me for her own entertainment." Mabel found her voice again, desperation sharpening her tone. "You can't just leave. Where would you go? You don't have any money, any connections. We're your family." The laugh that escaped me was as dry as old parchment. "Connections? Ruth, could you tell Mabel about those interview requests you mentioned?" Ruth smiled grimly. "I've had 3 publishers asking about Francine Gray's cookbook for the past 18 months. Netflix approached me last year about including her in a documentary series about pioneering female chefs. The James Beard Foundation wants to honor her with a Lifetime Achievement Award at next year's ceremony. That can't be true, Mabel whispered, but she was looking at her phone, probably Googling my name for the first time in her life. There's more, Ruth continued. Several restaurants in San Francisco have been trying to locate her for consulting work. One offered a 6-figure contract just last month. Seth's face had gone pale. Mom, is that true? People are looking for you? People never stopped looking for me, Seth. I just stopped looking for myself. I walked to the window and stared out at my cramped studio apartment, at the life I'd been living for 3 years. From this angle, it looked even smaller, even more pathetic. A place to hide, not to live. I want you both to understand something, I said without turning around. I'm not angry because you didn't know about my career. I'm angry because you never cared enough to ask. In 3 years, neither of you has ever inquired about my dreams, my regrets, my hopes for the future. You've treated me like a convenient appliance that came with the house. That's not fair, Seth protested. We've taken care of you. I turned back to face them, and something in my expression made both Mabel and Seth take a step backward. No, you've warehoused me. There's a difference. I looked directly at Mabel. You've enjoyed having someone to look down on, someone to order around, someone who made your life easier while you took all the credit. But mostly, you've enjoyed having an audience for your cruelty. I was never cruel, Mabel said, but her voice was barely a whisper. You made me eat dinner in the kitchen while your family ate in the dining room. You gave me a list of chores every morning like I was your employee. Last Christmas, you wrapped my present in the same paper you used for the gift bags for your manicurist and dog walker. The room was deadly quiet now. Even the few remaining guests had stopped pretending to have conversations and were listening openly to our exchange. And tonight, I continued, my voice gaining power like a storm building strength, you thought it would be amusing to hand me garbage bags in front of your friends and call me your maid. You wanted to see me broken and grateful, small enough to make you feel big. Ruth Wilson cleared her throat. If I may, she said, addressing Mabel directly. I've interviewed hundreds of chefs over the past decade. Francine Gray is considered royalty in the culinary world. What you've done here, it's like keeping Picasso in your basement and using him to paint your fence. Mabel's phone was buzzing constantly now, probably friends who had left the party early, checking in about what they'd witnessed. Her perfect Sunday afternoon gathering had turned into a social disaster, and everyone would know about it by tomorrow. So here's what's going to happen, I announced, my voice carrying the authority I'd used to command busy restaurant kitchens during the dinner rush. I'm moving out of your guest house. Today. Where will you go? Seth asked, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely concerned, rather than just worried about appearances. I smiled at Ruth Wilson, and she smiled back with understanding. I think it's time I rejoined the world. Ruth, about that interview. I can have a photographer here tomorrow if you'd like, and I know several people who would be thrilled to help you find appropriate accommodations while you figure out your next steps. Mabel was staring at her phone screen, her face growing paler by the second. There are articles about you, she whispered. Awards. Restaurants. You were famous. I still am, I said quietly. I just forgot for a while. The kitchen timer in my apartment finally went silent, either because whatever I'd been baking had finished or because it had burned beyond salvation. Either way, I no longer cared. I'll pack tonight, I told Seth. We can discuss the practical details later, but understand this. I won't be returning to clean up after you or babysit Jean or pretend to be grateful for scraps from your table. Mom, please don't do this, Seth said, and I could hear the panic creeping into his voice. We're family. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had stood by while his wife systematically stripped away my dignity. Yes, I said finally. We are family. And now you get to learn what it feels like when family abandons you. I walked toward the door, Ruth Wilson falling into step beside me. Behind us, I could hear Mabel beginning to cry, not from remorse, but from the dawning realization that her social reputation was in ruins and her convenient domestic arrangement was walking out the door. At the threshold, I turned back one last time. Oh, and Mabel, the cake you've been accepting compliments on all afternoon. The recipe will be published in my cookbook next year. I'll make sure to mention how it was inspired by my time in exile. The last thing I heard as we stepped into the garden was Seth's voice, calling after me with something that might have been desperation. Mom, wait. We can work this out. But I was done working things out on other people's terms. For the first time in 3 years, I was walking toward my own life instead of hiding from it, and it felt like coming back from the dead. 3 days later, I stood in the lobby of the Four Seasons downtown, watching Ruth Wilson stride through the revolving doors with a photographer trailing behind her. I had traded my faded house dresses for a charcoal suit I'd purchased that morning, the first new clothes I'd bought in 3 years. The transformation in the mirror had been startling. I looked like someone who mattered again. "Francine," Ruth said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "You look absolutely radiant. Ready to remind the world who you are?" The photographer, a young man with earnest eyes and expensive equipment, set up his gear in the hotel's restaurant while Ruth and I settled into a corner booth. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the city stretching out before us, a world I'd forgotten I belonged to. "So," Ruth began, placing her digital recorder between us, "let's start with where you've been for the past 3 years. The culinary world assumed you'd retired after your husband's death." I sipped my coffee, real coffee, not the instant crystals Mabel bought in bulk, and chose my words carefully. I became lost. When Marshall died in that car accident, I lost more than my husband. I lost my partner, my business manager, my best friend. The restaurants we'd built together became impossible to maintain without him. The truth was more complicated, of course. The accident had left me with medical bills that devoured our savings. The restaurant partnership dissolved in ugly legal battles. I'd been forced to sell everything, including our home, just to pay creditors. But I wasn't ready to share those details yet. "And your son's family took you in?" "They offered me shelter," I said carefully, "in exchange for household services." Ruth's expression tightened. "For 3 years, you were essentially working as unpaid domestic help for your own family." They told themselves they were being generous. I told myself I was being grateful. I set down my coffee cup, noting how my hands no longer trembled when I spoke about it. It took Mabel handing me garbage bags in front of a room full of people for me to remember that gratitude shouldn't require humiliation. The photographer signaled that he was ready, and for the next hour, I found myself falling back into the rhythm of professional interviews. Ruth asked about my signature dishes, my influences, the techniques I'd developed. With each question, I felt another layer of the diminished woman I'd become peeling away. "The industry has changed significantly since you stepped away," Ruth noted. "Female chefs are finally getting recognition, but it's still a struggle. Looking back, do you think you were ahead of your time?" I considered this. I wasn't trying to be a pioneer. I was trying to survive in a world that wanted me to fail. Every woman in professional kitchens learns to develop armor early, or she doesn't survive at all. And now? Are you planning a comeback? The question hung in the air like smoke. 3 days ago, I wouldn't have been able to imagine a future beyond Mabel's guest house. Now, possibilities stretched before me like an unread menu. "I'm exploring options," I said. "But this time, I'll be making decisions based on what serves me, not what's convenient for others." After the interview, Ruth walked me to the elevator bank. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that story will run in next month's issue. The response is going to be enormous. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Mabel, probably still dealing with the social fallout from Sunday's party. About Seth, who had called 14 times in the past 3 days, leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. About Jean, my granddaughter, who had texted me yesterday asking why Daddy seemed so sad. "I'm prepared for whatever comes," I told her. That evening, I sat in my temporary hotel room and called my lawyer for the first time in years. Scott McCarthy had handled Marshall's estate, and I'd been too broken then to pay attention to the details. Now, I needed to understand exactly what assets I still had. "Francine," Scott said, sounding genuinely pleased to hear from me, "I've been wondering how you were doing. Are you ready to discuss some financial matters we've left hanging?" "What kind of financial matters?" "Well, there's the trust fund Marshall set up before he died. You've never touched it. I assumed you wanted to leave it untouched for your son's inheritance. But it's been growing for 3 years now. My breath caught. How much are we talking about? With market gains? Just over $400,000? I sat down hard on the hotel bed. $400,000 had been sitting in an account while I'd been living on Mabel's charity allowance of $200 a month. Scott, I said slowly, why wasn't I aware of this? I sent the paperwork to your son's address when you moved in with them. I assumed. Didn't Seth give you the documents? The silence stretched between us like a taut wire. Seth had never mentioned any trust fund, never mentioned any paperwork from lawyers. For 3 years, he had let me believe I was financially dependent on his generosity while sitting on money that was legally mine. I need you to transfer that money to a new account, I said, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. And I need you to send me copies of everything you sent to my son's house. Of course. Francine, is everything all right? Everything is about to be. The next morning, I called the most expensive real estate agent in the city. By afternoon, I was touring penthouses with views of the bay, discussing lease terms and furnishing options. The agent, a sharp woman named Elsie, didn't ask questions about my 3-year gap in employment history. She simply nodded when I told her I was re-entering the market after a period of family obligations. This one has a chef's kitchen, Elsie said, leading me into a space that made my heart race. Professional-grade appliances, a marble island big enough to prep for 40 covers, windows that filled the room with natural light. The previous tenant was a cookbook author. She had it custom designed. I ran my hands along the countertop, imagining the meals I could create here. For 3 years, I'd been cooking on Mabel's basic electric stovetop, using mismatched pots and dull knives. This kitchen was a temple, and I was ready to worship at its altar. I'll take it, I said. Elsie blinked. Don't you want to see the rest of the unit? The kitchen is perfect. That's all I need to know. While Elsie drew up the paperwork, my phone buzzed with yet another call from Seth. This time, I answered. Mom, thank God. Where are you? Mabel's been crying for 3 days, and Jean keeps asking why you won't come home. I am home, I said, looking out at the city skyline. Or I will be, once I sign this lease. What lease? Mom, you can't afford to live anywhere else. You don't have any money. The lie hung between us like a blade. 3 years of letting me believe I was destitute while my own money accumulated interest in an account he controlled access to. About that trust fund, Seth. The silence on his end was deafening. You received papers from Scott McCarthy 3 years ago. Papers about a trust fund Marshall established for me. You never mentioned it. Mom, I can explain. You let me live like a charity case while sitting on $400,000 of my own money. You watched your wife humiliate me, watched me scrub your floors and wash your laundry, knowing I had the means to leave any time I wanted. We were protecting it for you, Seth said desperately. Mabel thought if you knew about the money, you'd make bad decisions. You weren't thinking clearly after Dad died. So you made the decision for me, for 3 years. We were trying to help. I laughed, a sound as dry as autumn leaves. No, Seth. You were trying to control. There's a difference. Please come home. We can work this out. I am working it out. Just not in the way you expected. I hung up and turned my phone off. Outside the penthouse windows, the city pulsed with life and possibility. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I was part of it again. Elsie returned with a stack of documents. Your credit check came back excellent, she said, looking puzzled. I'm surprised. Most people who've been out of work for several years have some issues. I wasn't out of work, I corrected. I was working for free. That evening, I met Ruth Wilson for dinner at the restaurant where I'd once trained the head chef. The young man, not so young anymore, nearly dropped his wine list when he saw me. Chef Gray? He stammered. Is it really you? Word spread through the kitchen faster than fire. Within minutes, the entire culinary team had found excuses to walk past our table. Several stopped to pay their respects, to thank me for techniques they still used, for lessons that had shaped their careers. This is what you've been missing, Ruth said quietly. This world still remembers you, still reveres you. I watched the controlled chaos of the dinner service through the open kitchen doors, felt the familiar rhythm of ordered pandemonium that had once been my natural habitat. I want to open a restaurant, I said suddenly. Not a comeback tour, not a nostalgia act. Something new. Something that shows the world I'm not the same chef who left 3 years ago. Ruth smiled. What would you call it? I thought about Mabel's shocked face when she learned who I really was. About Seth's panicked phone calls now that his convenient arrangement was crumbling. About 3 years of swallowing my pride and pretending their charity was kindness. Reclaimed, I said. I'd call it reclaimed. As we left the restaurant, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. When I opened it, I found a photo of Mabel crying at her kitchen table, sent by someone who'd clearly been at the birthday party. The message was simple. Everyone knows now. I deleted the photo without showing Ruth, but I couldn't delete the satisfaction that spread through my chest like warmth. Mabel's social humiliation was just the beginning. By the time I was finished reclaiming my life, they would all understand the true cost of taking a legend for granted. The war was just beginning, and I was finally ready to fight it on my own terms. 2 weeks after moving into my penthouse, I received an unexpected visitor. Jean, my 10-year-old granddaughter, stood in my doorway clutching a wilted bouquet of grocery store flowers and looking smaller than I remembered. Grandma Francine? Her voice was barely a whisper. Daddy said you don't want to see us anymore. I knelt down to her level, my heart clenching at the sight of her tear-streaked face. Of all the casualties in this war with her parents, Jean was the only one I hadn't wanted to wound. Come in, sweetheart, I said, taking her small hand in mine. How did you get here? I took the bus, she said, swiping at her nose with the back of her hand. I saved up my allowance for 3 weeks. The thought of this child navigating public transportation alone to reach me sent ice through my veins. I pulled out my phone to call Seth, but Jean grabbed my wrist. Please don't call them yet. They don't know I'm here. Mommy's been crying all the time, and Daddy keeps slamming doors, and I miss you. I set my phone down and guided her to the kitchen island, where I'd been testing recipes for Reclaimed. The space was a chaos of ingredients and notebooks, nothing like the sterile perfection of Mabel's kitchen where I'd spent 3 years tiptoeing around other people's lives. Are you hungry? I asked, already knowing the answer. Jean had inherited the Gray family appreciation for good food, and Mabel's cooking had always been more about presentation than flavor. I made her a grilled cheese sandwich. Not just any grilled cheese, but one with aged Gruyere and homemade sourdough, crisped to perfection in clarified butter. I watched her eyes widen as she took the first bite. This is the best grilled cheese in the whole world, she declared. And for a moment, I forgot about the war raging between her parents and me. Jean, I said carefully, settling beside her with a cup of tea, what has Mommy and Daddy told you about why I left? She chewed thoughtfully, her feet swinging from the tall stool. Mommy says you got too proud and forgot that family is supposed to help each other. Daddy says you're mad about something that happened at his birthday party, but it was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. 3 years of systematic humiliation reduced to a simple misunderstanding. What do you think happened? I asked. Jean set down her sandwich and looked at me with Marshall's intelligent eyes. I think they were mean to you, and now you're teaching them a lesson. The child's clarity was startling. In one sentence, she'd understood what Seth and Mabel refused to acknowledge. Sometimes, I said slowly, when people treat you badly for a long time, you have to show them that it's not okay, even if those people are family. But you still love me, right? The question came out small and frightened. Oh, sweetheart. I pulled her into a fierce hug. I will always love you. What's happening between your parents and me has nothing to do with how much I love you. We spent the afternoon cooking together. I taught her how to properly dice an onion, how to tell when oil was hot enough for sautéing, how to taste as you go. She absorbed every lesson with the focus of someone much older, asking questions that revealed an intuitive understanding of flavor that reminded me painfully of myself at her age. Grandma, she said as we pulled a batch of chocolate chip cookies from the oven. Could I come visit you sometimes, even if Mommy and Daddy say no? The question hung in the air like smoke from a burning bridge. I knew that agreeing would escalate the conflict with Seth and Mabel. But looking at this child, bright and curious and hungry for connection, I realized that some things were worth the fight. "We'll figure something out," I promised. My phone had been buzzing incessantly for the past hour. When I finally checked it, I found 17 missed calls from Seth and 12 from Mabel, along with a string of increasingly frantic text messages. The last one, sent 10 minutes ago, simply read, "We're calling the police." I sighed and dialed Seth's number. He answered before the first ring. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice sharp with panic. "Jean's missing and—" "She's with me," I said calmly. "She's safe." The relief in his voice was palpable, but it quickly morphed back into anger. "You can't just take our daughter without permission. That's kidnapping." "I didn't take her. She came to me, alone, on public transportation. Because apparently, her home has become such a war zone that a 10-year-old felt the need to escape it." The silence on the other end stretched long enough for me to hear Mabel's voice in the background, shrill with hysteria. "We're coming to get her," Seth said finally. "Of course you are. But Seth?" I paused, watching Jean carefully arrange cookies on a cooling rack. "When you get here, you and I are going to have a conversation about why your daughter felt she couldn't be honest with you about where she was going." They arrived within 20 minutes, a new record for Seth, who usually drove like he was afraid of his own shadow. I buzzed them up and waited by the door, Jean pressed close to my side. Mabel burst through the door first, her perfectly styled hair disheveled, her makeup smeared. She looked like she'd been crying for hours. She swept Jean into her arms with the desperation of someone who genuinely feared loss. "Don't ever scare us like that again," she whispered into Jean's hair. We thought something terrible had happened." Seth stood in the doorway, taking in the opulent space, the marble countertops, the professional appliances, the floor-to-ceiling windows with their commanding view of the city. His face was a map of confusion and something that might have been shame. "How can you afford this?" he asked quietly. "With the trust fund you forgot to mention," I replied, my voice arctic. "The one that's been accumulating interest for 3 years while I lived on your wife's charity allowance." Mabel looked up from Jean, her face flushing red. "We were protecting that money. You weren't in a state to make financial decisions." "I wasn't in a state to make any decisions, according to you. That was the point, wasn't it? Keep me dependent. Keep me grateful. Keep me small enough that you felt important." Jean pulled away from her mother and walked to the kitchen island, where she'd left her half-eaten cookie. The adults followed, and I watched Mabel's eyes widen as she took in the professional-grade setup. "This is bigger than most restaurant kitchens," she said faintly. "Because I'm opening a restaurant," I said matter-of-factly. "Reclaimed. The soft opening is in 6 weeks." Seth stared at me. "You're serious about this? You're really starting over?" "I'm not starting over, Seth. I'm picking up where I left off. There's a difference." Mabel was examining the ingredient-laden counters, her expression shifting from shock to something approaching envy. "You could have had all of this while you were living with us. If you'd just told us about the money." The lie hung in the air like grease smoke. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the email I'd received from Scott McCarthy that morning. "Your husband received notification about the trust fund every quarter for 3 years." I read aloud. "Bank statements, growth reports, tax documents, all sent to your address, all requiring signature confirmation." The color drained from Mabel's face. "Daddy," Jean said suddenly, her voice cutting through the adult tension. "Why didn't you tell Grandma about her money?" Seth knelt down to Jean's level, but his eyes stayed on me. "It's complicated, sweetheart." "No," I said firmly. "It's not complicated at all. Your parents thought they could control me by making me believe I had nowhere else to go. They wanted me dependent on their generosity so I'd never question how they treated me." "That's not true," Mabel protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Then explain why you never mentioned the quarterly statements. Explain why you told me I was a financial burden while sitting on $400,000 of my money. Explain why you thought it was appropriate to introduce me as your maid to your friends." Jean looked between the adults, her young face serious. "That's lying," she said to her parents. "You always tell me lying is wrong." "Jean, this is adult business," Mabel said sharply. "You don't understand. I understand that you were mean to Grandma, and now she doesn't want to live with us anymore, Jean replied with devastating simplicity. Seth stood up, his hands shaking slightly. Mom, what do you want from us? An apology? We can apologize. I looked at my son, this weak man who had inherited his father's gentle nature but none of his strength, and felt something cold settle in my chest. I don't want your apology, Seth. Apologies are for accidents, for mistakes made in good faith. What you and Mabel did was systematic and deliberate. Then what? Mabel demanded, her voice rising. What will it take for you to forgive us? The question I'd been waiting for. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the city below, at the world I was about to re-enter on my own terms. Forgiveness assumes that what you did was forgivable, I said without turning around. But you didn't just take my money or my dignity. You stole 3 years of my life. You made me believe I was worthless, that I was lucky to have your scraps, that I should be grateful for your condescension. I turned back to face them, and something in my expression made both of them step backward. You want to know what I want? I want you to live with the consequences of your choices. I want you to explain to your friends why your maid is opening a restaurant that will be featured in every food magazine in the country. I want you to wake up every morning knowing that you had a legend in your house and you treated her like dirt. You're our family, Seth said desperately. That has to count for something. I looked at Jean, who was watching this exchange with the kind of adult awareness that no 10-year-old should have to possess. Family, I said quietly, is supposed to protect and support each other. You did neither. You exploited me, humiliated me, and lied to me for 3 years. The fact that we share blood doesn't excuse that. Mabel was crying again, but this time her tears looked different, less like self-pity and more like genuine grief. We need you, she whispered. Jean needs you. Please don't punish her for our mistakes. I knelt down beside my granddaughter, taking her small hands in mine. Jean can visit me whenever she wants, I said, looking directly into Mabel's eyes. But it will be on my terms, in my space, without your supervision or interference. If you can't accept that, then you've made your choice. The apartment fell silent except for the sound of Mabel's quiet sobbing. Seth stood frozen, caught between his wife and his mother, unable to choose a side. Finally, Jean spoke up, her voice clear and decisive. I want to visit Grandma here, she announced, and I want to learn how to cook real food. Mabel's sobs grew louder, but she nodded through her tears. As they prepared to leave, Seth turned back to me one last time. Mom, he said, his voice barely audible. I'm sorry. I really am. I looked at him for a long moment. This man I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for, who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way possible. I know you are, I said finally, but sorry doesn't give me back those 3 years, and it doesn't change what you're capable of doing to people you're supposed to love. After they left, I stood in my empty kitchen and felt the silence settle around me like a warm blanket. For the first time in 3 years, I was completely alone, and it felt like freedom. 6 months later, I stood in the gleaming kitchen of Reclaimed, watching the dinner service unfold with the precision of a Swiss watch. The restaurant had been booked solid since opening night, with a waiting list that stretched 3 months into the future. Food critics had called it revolutionary, a masterclass in culinary storytelling, and the comeback that redefines comebacks. But tonight was special. Tonight was the Scott Beard Award ceremony after party, and I was hosting the industry's most influential figures in my own domain. Chef Gray, my sous chef called out. The amuse-bouche for table 12 is ready. I nodded, my eyes scanning the controlled chaos of the kitchen. Every movement was choreographed, every flame precisely controlled. This was my world, a place where excellence was demanded, not charity offered. Through the pass window, I could see the dining room filled with faces I'd known for decades. Critics who had once hung on my every word, chefs who had trained under me, restaurateurs who had tried to poach me for years. The culinary world had welcomed back Francine Gray with the fervor of a religious revival. Ruth Wilson approached the pass, her photographer trailing behind her. The Bon Appetit feature had been just the beginning. Since then, I'd graced the covers of Food and Wine and Saveur, and years earlier, Gourmet. The Netflix documentary crew had spent a week filming in my kitchen last month. Francine, Ruth said, her face glowing with professional satisfaction. I need a quote for the follow-up piece. How does it feel to be back? I plated the final course for table 8, duck breast with cherry gastrique, a dish I'd created in 1989 and refined to perfection over the decades, and met her gaze. I was never really gone, I said. I was just temporarily misplaced. The truth was more complicated, of course. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of 18-hour days, interviews, photo shoots, and the constant pressure of proving that Francine Gray hadn't lost her edge. But every exhausting moment had been worth it to stand here now, in my own kingdom, answerable to no one. My phone buzzed with a text from Jean. Saw you on TV again, Mom cried. Can I come cook with you tomorrow? I smiled, typing back quickly. Of course. We're making soufflés. Jean had kept her promise to visit regularly. Every Saturday, she'd arrive at my penthouse with her notebook and eager questions, absorbing culinary knowledge like a sponge. Watching her bloom under my guidance had been one of the unexpected joys of this new life. Mabel and Seth, however, remained persona non grata. They'd tried various approaches over the months, tearful phone calls, unexpected visits, messages sent through Jean. I'd remained unmoved by all of them. The kitchen door swung open, and my maitre d' approached with a concerned expression. Chef, there's a situation at table 15, he said quietly. A gentleman claiming to be your son. He says he needs to speak with you urgently. I set down my knife and wiped my hands on my apron. Through the pass window, I could see Seth sitting alone at a corner table, his face gaunt and aged in ways that went beyond the passage of 6 months. Send him to my office, I said. I'll be there in 5 minutes. My office was a sanctuary of polished wood and leather, walls lined with awards and photographs from my illustrious career. Seth sat in the chair across from my desk, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped a manila envelope. You look terrible, I observed, settling into my chair with the calm authority I'd cultivated over decades of running restaurant empires. He did look terrible. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hair had gone significantly grayer. The weak man I'd raised had grown even weaker under pressure. Mom, he began, his voice cracking slightly. I know you don't want to see me, but I had to come. It's about Mabel. I leaned back in my chair, saying nothing. She's not doing well. The social fallout from the party, the divorce. Divorce? I interrupted, feeling the first flicker of genuine surprise in months. Seth nodded miserably. I filed 2 months ago. I couldn't. After what we did to you, I couldn't stay married to her. Jean's living with me full-time now. So Mabel had lost her husband, her stepdaughter's respect, and her social standing. The information settled in my chest like warm honey. And Mabel's response to this? I asked. She's been calling everyone we know, trying to tell her side of the story, saying you've turned us against each other, that you're manipulating Jean, that you've poisoned the whole family. I almost laughed. Even in defeat, Mabel couldn't accept responsibility for her own actions. Seth leaned forward, the envelope clutched in his hands. But that's not why I'm here. I'm here because of this. He slid the envelope across the desk. Inside, I found a thick stack of legal documents. What am I looking at? I asked, though I was already scanning the papers. It's a lawsuit. Mabel's suing you for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She's claiming you deliberately destroyed her reputation out of revenge, and she wants damages tied to the value of this restaurant. I read through the documents more carefully, noting the creative legal arguments Mabel's attorney had constructed. According to the filing, my malicious abandonment of my family duties had caused irreparable harm to Mabel's mental health and social standing. The suit demanded damages for emotional distress, loss of social status, and punitive awards that would essentially bankrupt me. She's also claiming that the trust fund money was intended for the family, not just you. Seth continued. She says Dad would have wanted it used to support Jean's future, not to fund your vanity project. I set the papers down and studied my son's face. He looked genuinely frightened, which struck me as appropriate. And what do you think about this lawsuit? I asked. Seth's hands twisted in his lap. I think Mabel's lost her mind. I think she can't accept that her actions have consequences. But Mom, she has a good lawyer, and she's very angry. She could make things difficult for you. I stood up and walked to the window overlooking the bustling restaurant. Below me, the dinner service continued with flawless precision. This world I'd rebuilt, this empire I'd reclaimed, Mabel thought she could take it from me with legal papers and manufactured grievances. Seth, I said without turning around, do you remember the last thing I said to you the day I moved out? You said we were family, and now we'd learn what it felt like when family abandons you. And what have you learned? The silence stretched long enough that I turned to look at him. Tears were streaming down his face. I learned that I'm weak, he whispered. I learned that I let my wife abuse my mother for 3 years because it was easier than standing up to her. I learned that I'm nothing like Dad. No, I agreed. You're nothing like your father. I also learned, he continued, his voice gaining strength, that I don't want to lose you completely. Jean needs you. I need you. Even if you can never forgive me, please don't let Mabel destroy what you've built. I returned to my desk and picked up the lawsuit papers. Do you know what Mabel's mistake is, Seth? He shook his head. She thinks I'm the same broken woman who moved into your guest house 3 years ago. She thinks she can intimidate me, manipulate me, make me small again. I smiled, and Seth actually flinched. She has no idea what she's about to face. I pressed the intercom button on my desk. Ava, please get Scott McCarthy on the phone. Tell him it's urgent. While we waited for the call, I studied my son's haggard face. Tell me something, Seth. Why did you really file for divorce? Because Jean asked me why I never protected you, he said quietly. She's 10 years old, and she understood something that took me 35 years to figure out. Mabel isn't a victim in this story. She's a bully who found an easy target. The phone rang, and Scott McCarthy's familiar voice filled the room. Francine, what can I do for you? Scott, I'm sending you a lawsuit that was just served. I need you to review it tonight and prepare a countersuit. What are the grounds? I looked directly at Seth as I spoke. Financial fraud. Mabel and Seth concealed my trust fund for 3 years while I provided unpaid domestic services. I want to sue them for theft of services, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Seth's face went white. Mom, you can't. The household services I provided, I continued, cooking, cleaning, childcare, entertaining, would have cost them roughly $6,000 per month if they'd hired professionals. Multiply that by 36 months, add interest and punitive damages, and we're looking at significant money. And the fraud charges? Scott asked. They deliberately concealed my financial assets to keep me dependent on their charity. That's textbook financial elder abuse. Seth was staring at me with something approaching awe. You've been planning this. I've been preparing for this, I corrected. The moment Mabel handed me those garbage bags, I knew this day would come. She would never accept losing gracefully. Francine, Scott said over the phone, this kind of countersuit could destroy them financially. Good, I replied without hesitation. After I hung up, Seth sat in stunned silence. Finally, he spoke. What do you want me to do? I want you to choose a side, I said. You can stand with Mabel and face the consequences of what you both did to me. Or you can testify about the trust fund concealment and help me end this once and for all. And if I testify against Mabel? Then maybe, someday, we can begin to rebuild some kind of relationship. For Jean's sake, if nothing else. Seth stood up slowly, looking older than his 35 years. I'll testify. I'll tell them everything. About hiding the trust fund, about the way Mabel treated you, about how we let it happen. I nodded. Good. Now leave. I have a restaurant to run. As he reached the door, he turned back one last time. Mom, I really am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to hear it. I looked at this broken man who had once been my little boy, who had watched his wife systematically destroy his mother's dignity and done nothing to stop it. Sorry is just a word, Seth. It's actions that matter. When you sit in that courtroom and tell the truth about what you both did to me, then we can talk about whether sorry means anything. After he left, I returned to my kitchen. The dinner service was winding down. my staff cleaning and organizing with the efficiency I demanded. This was my world now, a place where excellence was rewarded, where hard work paid off, where I was surrounded by people who respected my talent rather than exploiting my vulnerability. Ruth Wilson was still at her table, scribbling notes for her article. When she saw me, she raised her wine glass in a silent toast. Tomorrow, Mabel's lawsuit would become public record. The story would spread through the culinary world like wildfire. The legendary Francine Gray fighting back against the family that had tried to keep her small. But I wasn't worried. I had built an empire once before. I had survived loss, betrayal, and 3 years of systematic humiliation. Mabel thought she could break me with legal papers and manufactured grievances. She was about to learn the difference between a survivor and a victim. The kitchen timer chimed, signaling the end of service. But for me, the real victory was just beginning. Now tell me, what would you have done if you were in my place? Let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to check out the video on your screen right now. I'm sure it will surprise you.